The morning they told her, Eliza Ashford was in the kitchen garden pulling up the last of the season's carrots, her hands dark with soil, her hair coming loose from its pins in the wind off the mountain. She heard her name through the open parlor window, not called, but spoken, the way people speak of furniture being moved from one room to another. "Eliza will do nicely for this," her father said. "Caldwell's isolated enough that her behavior won't embarrass us further." Her mother said nothing. Her brother laughed, short and sharp, the way he laughed at things that weren't funny but confirmed what he already believed. She stayed crouched in the dirt a long time after the voices moved on. The carrots were still in her hands. The mountain sat blue and enormous on the horizon, the same mountain it always was, unchanged and indifferent, and she thought, "I have been a problem to be solved my whole life. And now they have found the solution." She did not cry. That surprised her later. She had thought she might. Instead, she finished pulling the carrots, washed her hands at the pump, and went inside to hear what they would tell her, which was a softened version, a dressed-up version, full of words like opportunity and respectable match and a man of considerable property. Her father watched her face for the tears, for the argument, for the dramatic scene that Eliza Ashford could always be counted on to produce. She gave him none of it. She said, "When do I leave?" and watched something flicker behind his eyes. Relief, mostly, but a thin thread of something that might have been shame if he had been a different man. She left on a Thursday. Her trunk was packed by her own hands because the housemaid had been given other tasks, or perhaps had simply not been told to help. It was the kind of small cruelty that her family didn't recognize as cruelty. Her mother came to the doorway of the bedroom while Eliza was folding her good wool dress. She stood there for a moment. Eliza waited. "You might find it better than you expect," her mother finally said, which was the closest she would come to either apology or hope, and Eliza said, "Yes, Mama," and folded the dress, and that was the end of that. The stage road north out of Birch Creek climbed for most of the first day. The driver, an old man named Holt with a face like cracked leather, didn't speak except to name the landmarks as they passed. "That's the Sutter Fork. That's the ridge they call the Widow's Back. You'll see the Caldwell Range once we clear the pines." She appreciated his economy. She watched the country change from the flat valley grassland she had known all her life into something older and steeper and more serious, granite shouldering up through the soil, the pines crowding the road until the light came through in pieces. She had heard things about Nathan Caldwell. Everyone in 3 counties had heard things. That he had come from somewhere east under circumstances that were never clearly explained. That he had built his ranch by hand over 12 years, starting with $100 and a mule, and that it now ran 500 head and employed 9 men. That he was hard but fair. That he had turned down 2 prior marriage proposals, not the women who had turned him down, but Caldwell himself who had declined, which was unusual enough to be talked about. That he had a temper, though no one could cite a specific incident. That he was not a man you wanted to cross. She was not afraid of him. That surprised her too. She examined the feeling carefully, the way she did when she didn't trust herself, and found that it was genuine. She was many things, tired, angry in a low and abiding way, uncertain about what came next, but she was not afraid. She had faced enough difficult men in her life to know the difference between a man who was difficult because he was cruel and a man who was difficult because he was serious. She did not yet know which kind Caldwell was, but she had learned at some cost to wait and see. He was waiting at the end of the road when the stage came down out of the pines into the valley where the ranch sat. He was taller than she'd expected, not dramatically, but solidly, the way a fence post is tall, built for purpose rather than impression. He wore a coat that had been good once and was still decent. He did not smile when she stepped down from the stage, but he removed his hat and he looked at her directly, which was something. Most men who came to meet Eliza Ashford looked at her and then quickly looked away, as if confirming something they'd already decided. He said, "Miss Ashford." She said, "Mr. Caldwell." Holt handed down her trunk without being asked. The ranch house was made of squared timber and riverstone, low and solid and oriented to catch the morning sun. It was not beautiful in any decorative sense, but it had the beauty of things built to last. And she noticed, getting down from the wagon, that the kitchen garden was twice the size of her father's, and that someone had winterized it properly, the beds mounded and covered with straw. She noticed because she knew what a kitchen garden looked like when it was cared for and when it wasn't. It was a small thing, but small things were usually the truest. He showed her the house himself. He did not call for anyone to do it. 2 rooms upstairs, the main room and kitchen below, a covered porch that ran the south side. Her room had a good window and a quilt on the bed that was not new but was clean and had been pressed. When they came back downstairs, he put a pot on the stove for coffee, and she stood in the center of the kitchen not knowing what to do with her hands, and he said without turning from the stove, "I want to tell you something before anything else is said." She waited. He turned around. He held his hat in both hands and looked at her steadily. He said, "I asked for you specifically. Your family thinks this suits them, and it might, but that's not why I asked. 3 years ago in Birch Creek, I watched you walk into an argument between a merchant named Goss and an old man named Ferris who did day labor on your father's property. Goss was cheating him. Everyone on that street knew it, and no one said a word. You were maybe 19. You walked up to Goss's counter and you told him in front of 8 people exactly what he was doing and what you thought of it, and you didn't stop until Ferris had his money. I have not forgotten it." The kitchen was very quiet. She could hear the wind against the south side of the house. "I have something else to say," he continued. "Your family asked for a bride price. I didn't pay it. I won't. I don't buy people." He paused. "What I will say is this: stay 1 month. Work the ranch if you want to. There's plenty that needs doing. Or don't work it. That's your choice too. At the end of the month, if you want to leave, I will give you a good horse, provisions, and enough money to get somewhere of your own choosing and start over. No argument, no conditions. You would owe me nothing." He set his hat on the table. "But if you stay, I would like it to be because you chose to stay. That's the only way it means anything." She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. He did not seem nervous exactly, but he was watching her carefully, the way a man watches something that matters to him. She said, "You've been waiting 3 years to say that." He said, "Yes." She said, "All right, 1 month." He nodded once and turned back to the stove and poured the coffee, and that was, in its way, the beginning of everything. She woke before dawn the next morning out of long habit and went downstairs to find the kitchen already lit, the stove already going, a man named Corbin she hadn't met yet feeding 2 dogs outside the back door. The ranch stirred early and without ceremony. She put on her work dress. She had brought work dresses. She had always owned mostly work dresses despite her family's wishes, and went outside into the cold morning dark and asked Corbin where she could be useful. He was a short, barrel-chested man of about 50 with a squint and a gray mustache. He looked at her the way men on ranches look at women who come down in work clothes at 5:30 in the morning, with re-evaluation. He said, "Kitchen's got no one steady since Mrs. Hale left in September. But if you're wanting outdoor work, Dominguez could use a hand with the mending on the south fence line." She said, "I'll start with the kitchen and see." She was, it turned out, a capable cook. Better than capable, though it wasn't something she'd ever been praised for, since cooking was simply expected, and expectation doesn't generate praise. By breakfast, she had fed 9 ranch hands and Caldwell himself, and there had been enough, and it had been hot, and she had done it in an unfamiliar kitchen with a stove that ran cold on the left side, which she had diagnosed by the second pan and adjusted for. Caldwell watched her carry plates with the same steady attention he seemed to give everything. He didn't comment, but he refilled his own coffee instead of asking her to do it, which told her something. The days began to have a shape. She rose early and managed the kitchen, and then, when the breakfast things were cleared, she went outside. Not because anyone told her to, but because the outdoors was where the actual work was, and she had never been good at being idle. She learned the fence line on the south pasture. There was a stretch near the creek where the posts were rotting and had to be replaced before winter made the ground too hard to dig. She learned it by asking Dominguez, a quiet man from Sonora who communicated mostly in nods and single syllables, but who, she discovered, would answer actual questions if you asked them plainly and waited for the answer. She asked him about the creek's flood patterns and the age of the posts and where the spare timber was kept, and he told her. And the second week she spent 3 mornings helping him replace the worst of the posts, swinging a maul in the cold air until her shoulders ached in a way that was honest and therefore satisfying. Caldwell saw her doing it on the 3rd morning. He came around the side of the pasture on horseback, checking something on the north fence, and pulled up when he saw her. He didn't say anything. He watched her set a post. She had learned to tamp the base tight before filling, and then he rode on. That evening, she found on the kitchen table a pair of work gloves, good leather, sized for small hands. There was no note. She put them on the next morning. It was the language he spoke she began to understand. Not words, which he used sparingly, but action. The gloves. The way he quietly repositioned the water barrel so she didn't have to carry full buckets across uneven ground. The way he told Corbin, within her hearing, that the south fence work she and Dominguez had done was some of the tightest post setting they'd had in years, which was not directed at her but was meant for her, and they both knew it. She received it the same way she received everything he gave her, with a quietness that matched his own, a not making much of it that was itself a kind of language. She began to understand the ranch as a thing with a character. It was serious and demanding, and it did not apologize for what it asked of people, but it was not arbitrary. The difficulty was honest. When she fixed a thing, it stayed fixed. When she learned a thing, she knew it. There was no one moving the goalposts, no one redefining the rules to ensure she could never quite satisfy them. The mountain didn't care who her father was. The cattle didn't care what drawing room she'd been found difficult in. She had lived her whole life in a world that kept telling her she was wrong for it, and here was a world that simply handed her a maul and showed her the post holes and let her prove what she was. She did not let herself think about Caldwell directly during those weeks. She thought around him, the way you don't look at the sun but track it by the light it throws. She noticed the way he was with his men. Demanding, yes, but without contempt, without the need to diminish them that she had seen in her father and in men like her father. She noticed the way the oldest dog followed him and the way he led it. She noticed that he read. The table in the main room had books on it that were used, the spines creased, the pages turned by a real reader, and that he read the same kinds of things she did, which were not the things women were supposed to read, but were instead histories and natural science, and she found tucked behind a surveying manual, a battered collection of Spanish poetry that made her stop and look at it for a long moment before she put it back exactly where she'd found it. The nights were the hardest, not because anything happened in them, nothing did, but because the house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when there are only two people in them, and she was aware of him in the way she imagined you became aware of weather, something large and exerting a pressure you couldn't see. She would hear him come in from the barn after the men had gone to the bunkhouse. She would hear him banking the main room fire. She would hear his boots on the stairs. She lay very still and listened to a silence that had somehow become a kind of conversation. She was at the end of the third week when her father came. She saw the horse from the kitchen garden, a roan she recognized, coming down the road from the pines. She stood up slowly and pressed her hands together to knock the dirt off and waited. She had known, in some part of herself that tracked such things, that this would happen. Her father did not give things away without retaining some claim on them. He rode into the yard with the bearing of a man arriving to collect what was his. There were two other men with him, neither of whom she knew. Caldwell came out of the barn. He stood with his hands at his sides and waited. Her father barely looked at Caldwell. His eyes found Eliza and stayed there. He said, "You're coming home." She said no. He looked at her the way he always looked at her when she spoke plainly, like she was weather he hadn't predicted and personally resented. He said, "I made no proper arrangement with this man. You've been kept here unlawfully." She said, "I've been here by my own choice." He turned to Caldwell then. He said, "You've corrupted her thinking. You owe my family what was agreed." Caldwell said, "I agreed to nothing and I owe your family nothing. Your daughter came here under no terms that obligated her. She may leave whenever she chooses." Her father had brought men because her father always understood power in terms of bodies and leverage. He said something to one of the men beside him. She didn't hear what, and she saw the implication of it, the shape it was taking, and she stepped forward. She said, "Father," not loudly. She had learned over 22 years that loud got you dismissed. She said it at a pitch that made him stop and look at her, really look, the way he rarely had. "You told Mr. Hargrove at the harvest assembly that I would disgrace this family before I was done. You told the women at Mrs. Pemberton's tea that you had no idea what to do with me. You told Mother the night before I left that you were relieved." She watched his face. "I know what I am to you. I've always known. But I am standing on this land by my own will and my own labor, and I am telling you that there is no authority you have over me anymore. And if you try to exercise one you no longer possess, I will say what I just said in front of every person in Birch Creek who will listen. And they will listen because people always do when the story is interesting, and this one is." The yard was very still. One of the horses shifted and blew. The older dog, the one that followed Caldwell, had come to stand beside her without her noticing, and she felt it lean briefly against her leg. Her father left. He was angry. She could see it in the set of his back as he rode. But he left. Caldwell said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Come and eat something." It's nearly noon. She followed him inside, and he made coffee, and she sat at the kitchen table and looked at her hands, which were not shaking, which she was glad of. He set a cup in front of her and sat down across from her, and they drank their coffee and said nothing for a long time, and the nothing was comfortable, which was new for her, in her experience with silences. She should have anticipated what her father would do next. She did not, which she blamed on the leftover relief of having faced him and survived it. He went to the county seat. He had friends there, men who measured friendship in favors owed, and within 5 days, Caldwell had 2 men ride up with a writ, falsely notarized, claiming that he had taken a horse from the Ashford property in a dispute 2 years prior. It was fabricated. She could see that from the language of it, the vagueness of the dates, the witnesses who were 2 of her father's laborers. But it didn't need to be true to be effective. They took Caldwell without violence, because he would not give them cause for it, and she stood in the yard and watched him go, and felt something settle cold and purposeful in her chest. Corbin came to stand beside her. He said, "There's nothing to be done about a magistrate's writ, miss." She said no, but there might be something to be done about the magistrate. She saddled the gray mare herself. Caldwell had shown her the horse in the first week, introduced it as if it were a person worth knowing, which she had appreciated, and she rode down the mountain alone. It was a 7-hour ride to the county seat, and she did it straight through, stopping only once to let the horse water at the Sutter Fork. She arrived in Breckenridge as the afternoon light went long and amber, and she was dirty from the road, and her hair was loose, and she had passed through Tired into something on the other side of Tired that was very clear and very calm. She knew what she needed. She had thought about it the whole way down. The county clerk was a man named Aldous Webb, who had, according to the writer's receipt she had found tucked in Caldwell's surveying manual, witnessed the purchase of Caldwell's property grant 12 years prior, which meant he had been in office long enough to know who was honest in Breckenridge and who was not. She found him at 6 in the evening in his office above the land registry, working late the way careful men work late. She told him everything. She had the bill of the notarized writ. She had taken it from the yard. And she told him the dates, which were wrong, and the witnesses, who were her father's men, and the magistrate, who was Aldous Webb's colleague, and therefore a delicate problem, and she laid it all on his desk like cards face up and said, "I am asking you to look at this. I am not asking you to do anything that compromises you. I am asking you to look at what is here and tell me if it holds together." He was quiet for a long time. He had the look of a man who had spent his professional life trying to stay out of things and who had mostly succeeded, and who recognized, with some mixture of wariness and relief, a moment when staying out was no longer an available option. He looked at the documents. He looked at them for a long time. He said, "The witness signatures are the same man's hand, signed twice under different names." She said, "Yes." He said, "That's forgery." She said, "Yes." He said, "That's a serious charge to bring against Thomas Ashford." She said, "I know it is." He looked at her. She was dirty and tired and 22 years old and sitting very straight. He said, "You're his daughter." She said, "I was." He released Caldwell at 8 that evening. She was waiting outside the county jail when they brought him out. He stopped when he saw her and looked at her, that steady, careful look, and she could see him doing what he always did, which was taking account of what was actually in front of him rather than what he expected. He said, "You rode down alone." She said, "Yes." He said, 7 hours. She said, 7.5. The ford was high. He was quiet for a moment. The street was mostly empty. The lamplight caught the side of his face. She could see something in him that she had not quite seen before. Not the steady quiet, but what lived under it, which was not cool at all, but was in fact very warm and very old, and had been there a long time. He said, "Eliza." He had never used her given name before. Just that one word. Just her name. She felt it go through her the way cold water feels when you are genuinely thirsty, a relief so thorough it was almost alarming. She said, "The month isn't up yet." He said, "No." She said, "I'm staying." He looked at her. He said, very quietly, the words that had perhaps been in him for 3 years, from the moment he had watched a 19-year-old girl walk up to a dishonest man's counter in Birch Creek and say plainly what needed saying. "You don't have to earn a place here. You've had one from the beginning." She understood, hearing that, what she had been doing since she arrived, not deliberately, not calculatedly, but from the deep reflex of someone who had been in imposition so long she had ceased to believe she could simply be. The fence posts. The kitchen. The gloves she'd reached for without acknowledging what they meant. She had been earning, Always earning, and he had been watching and wanting to tell her that the ledger had never existed. She didn't cry. That was still surprising to her, still a thing she noticed about herself. But she felt something give way that had been held in place a long time. They were married 3 weeks later in the main room of the ranch house. Dominguez and Corbin were there, and the other men, and Holt, the stage driver who had named the landmarks on her way up and who seemed pleased to attend. A circuit preacher named Marlowe said what needed to be said in about 4 minutes, which was the right amount. There were no silk gloves, no imported flowers, no dining room full of people performing sentiment they didn't feel. There was coffee and corn cake afterward, and Dominguez played guitar on the porch until the stars were fully out. An old song she didn't know the name of, that went the way good songs go, like it had always existed and someone had simply found it. She stood on the porch afterward, leaning against the post, listening. The mountain was dark against a sky so thick with stars it looked almost tactile. Caldwell came to stand beside her. He stood close but not touching. He had always given her the exact amount of space she needed and no more, which was perhaps the most intimate thing anyone had ever done for her. She said, "What was it exactly that I said to Goss?" 3 years ago. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You said that a man who cheats laborers is a man who has decided that other people's survival matters less than his convenience, and that you found that decision morally ugly, and also, if he cared about such things, socially inadvisable." She laughed. She hadn't known she was going to. It came up unexpected, genuine, and she heard it in the night air and thought, "I have not laughed like that in a very long time." She said, "That sounds like me." He said, "It does," and there was something in his voice when he said it. Not admiration exactly, though that was part of it, but something quieter and more specific. Recognition. The tone of a man who has found the thing he was looking for and finds that it is exactly as he expected and better. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. The lamp from the window put a line of light along the edge of his jaw. She thought about the Spanish poetry behind the surveying manual. She thought about the gloves, sized for small hands, left without ceremony. She thought about a man who had watched one moment of ordinary courage 3 years ago and had decided, quietly and without asking for anything, that this was a person worth waiting for. She reached up and touched the side of his face, just briefly, just to confirm the reality of it. He turned into it very slightly, like a thing that has been cold and is now warm, and that was all. That was enough. It was the most they had said to each other that hadn't been about fence posts or coffee or what needed doing. The guitar went on in the dark. The mountain held the whole sky on its shoulders like it always had. She was, she understood, in a place that was hers. Not because she had been brought to it, not because someone had decided it for her, but because she had ridden 7 hours down a mountain alone and told the truth to a careful man in a lamplight office, and come back up in the dark, and chosen. The difficult daughter. The problem to be solved. She stood on the porch of a house that was now hers and felt, for the first time in her life, not merely present, but arrived. Inside, the stove she had learned to manage was warm. Outside, the night was very large and very cold and very full of stars. She was exactly in the middle of it, which was exactly the right place to be.